me okay? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, it'll be one of those three. Really great to see you here today, and this is the Making VR Accessible to All session with Chris Lewis. My name is Tim Jackson. I am one of the co-track leads for the Diversity and Access track, along with Anna, who was here a minute ago. Oh, there she is. Along with Anna, who's also the other co-host for this event. So thank you very much for turning up today. I just want to tell you a little bit about Chris, who's going to be doing the talk today. So Chris Lewis is an IT lecturer for vCollege, and essentially it's a very interesting thing that we start off with here, because Chris tells us that he was going to be a forensic histologist and cut up dead bodies for a living, which is an interesting thing given that he stood right behind me. So he wanted to keep computing and programming as a hobby originally. He thought it would be harder the other way round unless he became a serial killer. Chris, I'm a little bit worried about this now. However, fate had other ideas, and he ended up combining a love of medicine with computing by reading Cybernetics at Reading University. After a brief stint in medical software, he became a lecturer in IT at Grantham College, specialising in programming and creating accessibility applications to help students. I have an awful lot more I could tell you about Chris, but actually what I'd like to do is to hand over to him, and Chris, take it away. Tell us all about you. Tell us what you do and what you're here to talk about today.
Well, I've been doing virtual reality, if you like, since I was about 16. So this has been several years because I'm now sort of old and ancient, decrepit. I'm also very much less educated, I suppose, than quite a lot of the people here on their third PhDs. My best achievement, I think, is that I can tie my own shoelaces. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is something that is very important, and we're looking at accessibility within the VR environment. So first of all, I've got a nice picture of a few people with different headsets on. Everyone here, I hope, is aware of what is meant by accessibility, but unfortunately lots of people think that it's to do with disability, etc. And although that comes into it, it's not as important as you might think. Now, here we have a picture of lots and lots of different people in lots of different situations, and that's what accessibility is all about. It might be that certain people have a screen such as the guy with the white and black in our sort of middle left of the screen, where you haven't actually got any controllers. You're just accessing something almost like in a 2D world, but with 3D environment. You might have head movements like I've got here now, or you might not even have that. You might be in a gaming environment like the little boy who's up in the top corner. So you've got a full gaming headset on, you're going to be doing full body motion, etc. You may be out and about like the person who's in the top right corner, or you might just be sort of on some sort of mobile headset and just looking at something in a different way. So what's really important is we talk quite a lot about inclusion. And when we talk about inclusion, we should be talking about what's shown in the top diagram there, which is where everybody is actually all together doing the same thing. Most things that we see in the real world end up being with people certainly being excluded, segregated or integrated, and you can see hopefully from the diagrams the differences between them. So exclusion, you stop people from being able to access it. Segregation, you give someone a separate space in order to do the same thing that the rest of everyone else can do. But integration, you have sort of a subspace. You have sort of an understanding that some people won't be able to do everything everyone else will be able to do, but they'll at least be able to do something similar. The aim, obviously, is that we should be looking for inclusion for everybody. So how can we do that? Well, when I was at Reading Uni, my final year project was to build an audio Formula 1 game. So it was using 3D sound to let people who were completely blind play a 3D Formula 1 going around the track. They could hear where the edges were, etc. What you see here, this blue screen, isn't the actual game, but it is an artist's impression of the game. As you can see, the graphics were non-existent as it used completely 3D sound. Now, when I built this back in many years ago, 2001, I saw this as a way of being integrated and inclusive because it allowed everybody to be able to play a Formula One game. So I was wrong, really. It was completely segregative because actually it stopped anyone who could see actually wanting to play it, because all that happened was they wanted to see they wanted the flash graphics, etc. What would have been much better, obviously, was if it was the 3D graphics as well as the 3D sound to allow everyone to play it, so sighted and unsighted people could actually play it together, which would have been much more sensible. Now, before I carry on with anything else, I know you've all got, hopefully, access to emojis and things. Now, let me see which emoji. Could everyone put their hand up emoji on, just so I can just double check everyone can hear me and that you can actually control your emojis. Fantastic, thank you. What I'd like to ask on a show of hands first of all, how many people here are actually accessing this talk via a PC rather than a headset? So we have one person over there, 2 people over there, 3 people. How many people are using a PC virtual reality device? One person over there. How many people are using a standalone VR device such as a Quest, an Oculus Go or something like that? Now that's a really important sort of aspect of inclusivity and accessibility. I'm using an Oculus Go at the moment, which is why I have one hand that can carry on waving, and that's about it. And it's one of the easiest ways of getting into VR, obviously, because you just turn it on, press a few buttons and you're there, rather than having to organise getting your PC working, etc. So all of us are looking at different interfaces, situations and experiences in VR. And that's really what accessibility is all about, and how we can try and come up with a conceptual framework for making VR much more accessible for everybody. Talks like this actually are really important as well, because they help people like the people who run AltSpace to actually understand some of the difficulties that there are actually making something like this accessible to everybody. So we have people from all sorts of different time zones, etc. here at the moment. Let me just go past my slide. There we go. But what we need to remember is that true accessibility is just in a setup that works for the particular environment that you're in. So I'm currently sat downstairs in my kitchen at a table. I'm using an iPad to actually run the slideshow as well as talking on here, and that kind of works easy enough for me at the moment. But just as easy it would be to be in an office with a laptop and actually doing this with a headset on, talking from a computer perspective. So the first item that I want to talk about is making sure that VR is easily approached or entered. Setup time for an Oculus Go is about 30 seconds, which isn't too bad. PC, depends how fast your PC boots. If you're using a PC 3D headset such as a Vive, you would have to then set all of that up, check the base stations are working. It takes a long time. So getting accessible in VR really needs the systems that we have to be as quick and easy to actually access as anything else. However, there's some other issues as well when you talk about being easily approached or entered. The fear factor is huge. Now, I know a lot of people who are scared of using VR visors. They don't like the enclosure of having a screen on their head. They can't see the real world. They feel it somehow isolates completely from the real world in a way that actually isn't very good for them. It makes them feel quite intimidated. So there's different ways of being able to access VR that would allow the fear factor to subside. One of the main ways would be to be able to actually still see the real world while you're in VR at any opportunity that you wanted to. So press a button and the cameras on whatever device that you've got or something similar would bring you back into the real world quite quickly. I was talking to someone who was deaf recently who was using VR, and they wanted me in my other life as a programmer to see if I had any suggestions for how they could have that sort of access to the real world, if you like, at the same time as being in VR, because when they're fighting zombies or whatever it might be that they're doing, they don't want their partner to have to tap them on the shoulder to actually know that there's something that they need to do in the real world. So we came up with some ideas that would be possible. For example, if someone else was in the room with you, um, you could do things like have them say a keyword, the equivalent of the Hey series and things like that, which is hopefully not going to trigger my iPad, so that they could actually talk to your device and say to your device, can you please bring us back to the real world? Or as soon as they say that, the game freezes, or whatever it is that you're doing freezes, and then suddenly the person's back in the real world and they can have a conversation, and then they can continue if they need to. Other ways of doing it would be obviously to have a handset controller, a single button, which allows you to access then the real world in the same way as you can with the Quest as you go through the Guardian. So something along those lines. So there's quite a few different fear factors that prevent people from using VR. Something else that's quite interesting, I work a lot with students the age range between 16 and probably 35. The people who are most interested in VR are the people from my generation, the people who at the age of 16 in 1996 played on virtuality machines, not necessarily the people who are actually coming up and into the system now. As a show of hands, how many people here are in, I would say, the 25 to 40 age bracket? Most people, or have we got anyone who's in the younger age bracket between sort of 15 and 25? Yep, one person's putting their hand up. Yep, and my stepson's putting his hand up, obviously. Is there anyone who is older than 40 here? So, as I say, it looks very similar to the sort of age ranges that I've seen elsewhere. The generation that's actually more interested in VR is actually the sort of people who grew up in the analog world in the 1980s, moving on to the digital world now. Physical issues then. Physical issues are huge for people with disabilities. It's a real shame that Google has cancelled their Daydream platform, because it was a really useful platform for people who were able to access things in their wheelchairs without having to worry about the 3 degrees of freedom, 6 degrees of freedom. Which some of you may or may not be aware of what I mean by that. 3 degrees of freedom is what I'm on at the moment. I can turn my head in all sorts of different ways, but I can't sort of control how tall or how short I am like you can on a Quest. That's 6 degrees of freedom. Well, 3 degrees of freedom is what you get with a mobile headset as well, and that's actually it should be possible. Everything that you can access in 6 degrees of freedom, you can pretty much do in 3 degrees of freedom, even if it means a more limited experience, because that actually stops people from having problems that might have, say, cerebral palsy or some other condition. Something else that we don't ever see or talk about is VR for people that are completely blind, or specifically very partially sighted. Now, obviously, you may think, why would someone wear a headset if they were almost completely blind? But most of the headsets that we use nowadays, including the Go that I'm on now, have 3D sound capabilities. And I could almost wander around Altspace just listening to where people were, if we're not all magnified with our voices. And I can hear where people are in relation to myself, if they're on the left of me, right of me, how close or far away they are. There's no other waypoints that we could use in Altspace that would allow someone to actually navigate around the environment if they're partially sighted. But those sorts of things could be possible to be added to an environment and then only switched on for those people who have those sorts of issues. Similarly, there should really be a framework for people that have different visual conditions, such as macular degeneration, etc., so that the screen can actually be altered based on what they can see or what they can't see, and areas of the screen could be actually warped and twisted to make it easier for them to have a more full picture of everything that they're seeing around them. Easily obtained. The cost of VR is certainly coming down, so it's becoming more and more accessible to everyone. How many people here have actually got their own VR headset that they're using right now and aren't actually accessing it via something that they've got from a college or from an environment where they can borrow a headset? A few of you, most of you. That's all really good, but certainly there are some public arcades now available. The nearest city to where I live, which is Nottingham, has a couple of other VR experiences based in there. The first one being a sort of sit-down simulator style ride, and the other one being a full sort of warehouse, a bit like a completely clear environment that you can actually wander around in with a virtual reality helmet and you can play games in. These sort of public arcades are great for entertainment, but we don't use anything like that for something like a conference like this. We haven't got like a library somewhere where there's a group of people all sat with virtual reality visors on, or with a projector on the screen that actually is showing these sorts of items. But do we need these sorts of public environments anymore? Because some of the benefits of VR are that you can be wherever you want to be, perfectly accessible. So when something's as accessible in your home as it is going out into the public for, it makes it much more important. Easy to share is a huge issue with virtual reality at the moment. Now you can all see a slideshow behind me that is running inside a browser. What some of you won't be aware of is that each of you are seeing your own version of that slideshow. There isn't one version that I'm controlling. There is, each of you are connected to that same website separately, and as I make a change on one of my on the website which is controlling it, it then goes through to changing all the different pages that you guys are looking at. And that isn't very easy to share. So if I was to do something interactive on the board behind me, none of you would actually be able to see what buttons I was clicking or what sections I was going to, unless it actually changed the URL of the web page, and then it would change for all of you as well. And that can be quite tricky to allow things, to make things easier for people to share. So that's something else to take in mind when we're looking at building these sorts of VR environments. Making things easier to share would be much more simplistic. Now, that's not to say there aren't solutions out there. Big screen is a way that people can all go and watch films together in virtual reality, and there was Oculus Spaces, which allowed you to watch live events. But even in all of these sorts of situations, what you are seeing is each person getting a separate stream of that information, rather than just having one set of stream of information broadcast to everybody in almost a peer-to-peer way. And that can make things difficult for having shared experiences in VR. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it's much more difficult than it is, say, having a few people huddled around on a computer. If we were in a work environment right now and I wanted to scribble some notes on a pad of paper and pass it to one of you, I could do that quite quickly and easily. To do the same thing in virtual reality is almost impossible. I'd have to have some sort of virtual pad underneath me, a virtual pen to write on that pad, and that piece of paper would then have to be an object in 3D space that I could actually send to somebody. We have systems like Microsoft Teams and Slack which allow people to be together in a virtual environment, and these should be considered just as accessible VR spaces as something that is true virtual reality in 3D in a lot of cases. Now, making people easy to talk to. Obviously all of you here are able to hear me, hopefully, fingers crossed, and all of you on, quite a few of you on different platforms, which makes sense as well. So that's a really useful way of being able to show how technology is moving on. Something like AltSpace being accessible on PC in 2D mode as well as 3D sets is brilliant, but it's not available on mobile phones or tablets unless there used to be a version on Android, and I was able to pick up the APK actually for that, and I was able to run it on my Android device. But obviously it's not available in any Play stores or anything like that at the moment, and it's an old version that's a bit buggy, doesn't work as well. It would be really useful if all these sorts of shared experiences were available in some way for all the different platforms that we have available. And there's a group of people trying to do that and make that happen now, and they call it WebXR is the latest version. And WebXR is a really interesting environment. The only difficulties I've had with WebVR is the speed of actually being able to walk around, etc. On an Oculus Go, it's an underpowered machine. If I spin my head too fast, I get black boxes appear at the sides of my vision, and it takes some time to build up. So what I'm personally looking at doing at the moment is looking at building an engine which takes WebXR data and actually makes it a bit more efficient, built in Unity. I'm not the only person to be doing that. There's quite a few companies looking at something called Exotech, which does something very similar. but it does actually help things become much more cross-platform if we had a cross-platform language that we could actually build 3D worlds in and be able to use on different systems. Letting go of the real world is difficult, as I've already previously mentioned. You want to still be able to have access to the real world as well and have portals almost into the real world. So there's something that, there should be almost an accompanying app with anyone who's in virtual reality that allows people to be able to talk to them in the real world. For example, at the moment I'm getting notifications appearing on an Apple Watch, and because of the type of headset I've got, I can actually see my Apple Watch underneath my nose piece. But it would be much more useful for me sometimes if my notifications actually came up in here in virtual reality. Again, augmented reality or AR is going to be something that is probably going to be much more important to people than virtual reality for a lot of situations. Having conferences where you can see people virtually floating in front of you and talking to you rather than being completely isolated is probably something that is going to be really important in the future. So, there's a picture here that I've got which is an important one. One aspect of virtual reality which is quite well recognised is it being used in hospitals and involved in people where you actually want people to be taken out of the situation that they're currently in. Whether that be PTSD therapy, whether that be that they're suffering from burns or something like that, or even having surgery in some cases. There's all sorts of things that you can actually do to reduce pain just by distracting the brain without having to worry about medication. That's actually an MRI scan of looking at pain-related activity, and the same individual, they were going through a very hard time with third-degree burns over 75% of their body, and you can see that when they were immersed actually in an environment, it was a sea-based environment, they were swimming with dolphins, it wasn't interactive, it was just 360-degree 3D videos. They were actually much more happier and without pain than anywhere else. So sometimes this ability to be out of the real world is actually just as important as still being able to be in the real world. However, stopping us from doing that is things like intuitive controls. Now, I've got a very, very simple handset in my hand at the moment, as most of you have if you're on the Oculus Go or Quest. I can move my hand about, and it's very, very intuitive-ish for me to be able to put my thumb up or move around on this so I can teleport wherever I want to just by clicking a couple of buttons. That's great because I've got full access to my limbs. What happens if I am stuck in a wheelchair and I cannot have no physical control over my body in that way? Microsoft is doing a huge amount of work in accessible controllers, and their accessible controller for Xbox is phenomenal. It's the most amazing piece of work for allowing people to actually experience the controls, etc., together and play together no matter what type of physical ailments that you might have. But it doesn't work for everything, and it doesn't work for everybody yet. Where are we moving to with intuitive controls that would allow people to actually use VR in a much easier way? Some of the original VR systems actually got round a lot of problems by having a single dot that appeared in the middle of your screen. Some of you will remember this from Gear VR, and you just highlight over the item that you want to look at or move to. You'd wait a few seconds for a timer to run, and then it would cause that to be an action. Having that sort of ability would be really useful for a lot of people. Newer headsets are coming up with eye tracking, so they can actually see where you're looking at. The main reason that headset manufacturers want that is actually so that they can render things in more detail at the point where you're looking and lower detail where you're not, to save computing power. But another use of that is that you can actually look at an item and blink or do some sort of action and activate that item without actually having to use hands or feet or any other control mechanism. VR obviously is not just for games. We're proving that hopefully here today. And a lot of conferences could benefit from something like this. There's so many conferences that you have to travel to, you have to go to, where you're going to pick up illnesses, which is the big worry that people have at the moment with coronavirus being the big boogeyman of today. But there'll always be something somewhere that people are worrying about in terms of picking up something, or even difficulty in ways that where they can actually get to an item. There's lots and lots of conferences that might be in a main city that is easy to get to by train or travel if you live in that same country. But if you live in a different country, if you don't have the money or the ability to be able to go in those sorts of environments for whatever reason, it stops it from being accessible to you. If you can jump into a conference or into a presentation or lecture, especially with education, wherever you are, that becomes really, really powerful. As was mentioned by Tim at the start, I have a system that I call vCollege. It is not a virtual reality environment, it's a virtual learning environment, and it's completely two-dimensional. It allows you to access all your assignments, all your lesson plans, everything that you might need as a student as well as a teacher, wherever you are on any device. But it also has accessibility controls built in. So for example, the font can be changed to a dyslexia font. The colour scheme can be completely changed to whatever background colours or foreground colours that you need for whatever conditions that you might have. But also it allowed me to do live streaming. So every single one of my lessons, as I taught it in a lecture theatre or in a classroom, was live streamed on YouTube and was accessible by all the different students that I had wherever they might be. So if they were too poorly to come in for whatever reason, they could still follow along the lecture at home. They could also then talk via a text system to me and actually say exactly what they want to ask as a question, and I could then respond in real time through the live broadcast. They could also talk to me afterwards on text, so I could then explain things to them. Obviously, the entire live stream was then saved as a recording on YouTube, so that after those the lesson has finished, people can actually go back over those items to remind themselves of some of the things that I've talked about, rather than have to worry about referring to notes that might be scribbled, etc. A lot of people struggle making notes, and having that accessible at any point actually saves me a lot of work as a teacher, because I don't have to go over the same material several times. But also, more importantly, it means that the students can, when they're actually going through an assignment, they can refer to any of the different lessons that I talked about that assignment and actually go back over the information that they went through before. Right, where are we? So I'm having to look through my nose again. We've talked about all of this already, but some of the things where we haven't talked about, I suppose, are mobility. Now, if I had a stable 4G connection, I could possibly be on a train right now. Lots of people in a train carriage looking at me very funny, but I could be giving this presentation from a train as I'm on my way somewhere else through a headset, and I'm just as experiencing this as anyone else. But my mobility is fine. If someone has mobility problems, they can't necessarily use the same systems that we do, and that really does need to be taken into consideration when we are designing systems, and when I mean systems, I mean the software systems. Hardware can be adapted for different people's purposes, but what we need to do is think about, when we're making these platforms and software, how we can be as inclusive as possible. Whether that be, as I say, at the moment, everyone's seeing the same scene, I think, as I am. You're all seeing the same slideshow as I am, but what would be really useful is if those people who need like a yellow background and black writing could actually change my slides as we are speaking to make that happen. My vCollege system actually runs over the web, and I ran a lesson in virtual reality just like this. It was set in just a local space, and I did actually set that up so that my main projection that you can see in the background there, people were able to log into with their own settings, and as I moved from slide to slide, they actually had their own settings appearing for them, and nobody else knew about it, because at the end of the day, that's one of the benefits of virtual reality. We can actually alter the environment around ourselves to match what we need as individuals without it actually affecting what the other people in the same environment see or do. Processing speed is a really important one. Now, I talk really quite quickly, especially if it's a subject I'm excited about, passionate about, etc. And some people have problems with their processing speed. Now, with virtual reality working the way that it does, there's nothing to actually stop a program from being able to slow down this entire scene. So we could actually run this entire conference at half speed, for example, or 3/4 speed. And so those people who are running at that sort of speed, they get like a buffer of information, and as my live broadcast is continuing, they're living through it slower than everybody else that's here, but they can still listen in and take all that information in. A bit like a Sky Go box or a Sky Q box. You could actually possibly rewind this presentation if you'd missed something, or pause it, and the rest of this presentation could actually then continue for everybody else in the room. But for anybody who wants to be able to sort of focus on something else for a short while, just like any form of video footage, they could actually pause it and then bring it back in later afterwards. These are sort of really important aspects of communication. Being able to communicate in multiple languages would be a real benefit to VR. Now, how many people here have English as their first language? No, some people haven't, and unfortunately I have to speak in English because I can't speak in any other language. But again, wouldn't it be really useful if there was an automatic translation, either in text-based that was, as I talk, I have some subtitles underneath me, or a speech bubble above my head, just up there, so that you'd actually be able to understand what it is that I'm saying. Again, if anyone here was deaf, they'd have no way of knowing what I'm talking about, because there's no visual version of any of the words that I'm speaking about actually coming up on screen. There could be a live dictation, so showing as a speech bubble, or it could be that even if it wasn't possible to do on the fly because it wasn't fast enough, having the environment replayable afterwards in the equivalent of a virtual video, a 3D video that you can actually walk around in, but with all the phraseologies, all the wording either translated or at least subtitled, would be really useful for a lot of people. Now, this is the other part of accessibility. We're talking about VR, and we're all in here because we are the converted, if you like. We are the people who already know how good virtual reality is, simply because we're all interested in virtual reality, or we wouldn't be here. And this in itself is possibly a problem. Is this truly the future of education? Is it truly the future of how we move about? Well, there's a film and a book. I recommend the book over the film, but that's what I would do for most things, called Ready Player One. I wouldn't recommend it as a dystopian future that we want to go into, shall we say, but certainly it is a good example of where we could end up in a virtual environment, especially if the real world becomes more and more horrific for people to live in. But is it truly the future? I mean, I believe as long as we make things more accessible, that being able to teach in virtual reality is a really useful activity. Being able to, say, have this entire lecture theatre filled up with students from across the world to all teach the same subject at the same time would be really beneficial. And I know I'm not the only one. There's a lot of educators out there at the moment who are saying that because of the changes that we're doing with communication with our technology, it won't be long before teachers are the equivalent of the rock stars of this world, where they're paid an awful lot of money if they're good at their job to be able to teach and educate students from all over the world to the best of their ability, and to be able to give a high level of education to people who wouldn't necessarily be able to achieve it any other way. However, we are all in a bubble. If you're in a Twitter feed like I am, most of my Twitter feed has everybody really interested in virtual reality. This is mainly because the type of people that I follow, and therefore I'm in a bubble, and by looking at my feed, everybody in the world loves virtual reality. That must be true. Luckily, I'm nicely grounded by my partner who hates virtual reality. She's not a technophobe, but she certainly doesn't like the fact that this is so intrusive, if you like, in becoming isolating. So I'm able to understand things from a bit of a different perspective and see, well, maybe sometimes the best answer for virtual reality isn't necessarily to wear a headset like this I'm doing now, but maybe a 2D environment. said about it earlier, which generation likes it most. I was actually quite surprised that most of my students are not interested in virtual reality in the way that I thought they would be. Certainly I was more of a driving force into it than the students themselves. However, having said that, as soon as they start experiencing what they can do in virtual reality, things change. And I think for a lot of people, they are very, very limited in what they think virtual reality can actually do for them and what they feel the environment's actually like. And they're not aware of some of the advantages of virtual reality. However, with the younger generation that have grown up with Pokemon Go, virtual AR devices on their phones, etc., I think it's going to very much be that AR becomes their first environment rather than VR. And so VR will be a secondary environment to AR. Whether that's a good thing or not is a matter of opinion. Personally, I think any form of inclusion, any form of accessibility to help people in environments to be able to achieve what they need to achieve and do what they need to do is important rather than the technology that's being used. So, quick conclusion then. We need to get buy-in from the public for virtual reality, and the only way you can do that is to make it accessible for everybody. It doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are. It shouldn't mean that you have to wear a headset and be isolated from the environment around you. It shouldn't stop you from being able to use virtual environments and making things in such a way that you will actually be happy to be in the environment that you're in. There are a lot of positives to virtual reality, and the best way to get by is to show the positives it makes to their lives. When I first started my experiments in live streaming my lessons, I may have had one person, and it all started with one person who was too ill to attend lessons for a short period. By the time last year, I had two members of the class who were on long-term sick, who were still able to attend every lecture. And both of them actually went to achieve distinction qualifications in their HNDs, which they would not have been able to pass at all if it hadn't been for the ability to show them, look, this sort of virtual communication is really important. We're currently in what's called the lead time for virtual reality. We're still at the start point of a graph of getting people to be interested. The Quest has been an amazing success this Christmas time. It was out of stock everywhere. They can't make them fast enough. And it's items like these, hardware like these, that I see as the future of virtual reality rather than having to attach it to clunky PCs. People today, especially young people, are not using PCs. They're using phones, they're using tablets. There's a company called Nreal who's just made a augmented reality set of glasses that work with Android phones that in less than 2 months now will be selling to the public for I think about £300 or $300. That's going to be a huge and massive part of the next generation, if you like, of virtual reality. But the most important thing I think we all want to make sure of is that this doesn't end up being yet another 3D TV. I never owned a 3D TV as much as I'm interested in technology. However, I'm really pleased that they existed because it means I've got a lot of 3D films now that I can watch on my Oculus Go. However, 3D isn't necessarily the answer for everybody, and we don't want 3D TV's legacy, if you like, to taint virtual reality and augmented reality. To make that happen, we need to be inclusive and we need things to be accessible. And that's it. So, any questions?
That's great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was a really interesting presentation. Can we just have some clapping emojis for Chris, please?
Thank you.
That was awesome. Fantastic. It's quite interesting that you were talking about that the first point that you felt you needed to do this was when you had a member of the class, a student, off sick. And it's quite interesting because I had that experience myself this year, and
Oh, wow.
we happened to be doing a virtual reality session, and consequently I was able to include that student, and in fact afterwards they said how much that they'd enjoyed the session even though they weren't there, and were really glad that they were able still to join. So this is a really powerful technology that we can use, and it is going to allow for a greater level of inclusion rather.
I think you're right. There's another aspect to this actually with robotics. Originally, my idea was I've got a little Cosmo robot, which has a camera built in. And I wondered if there was any way that the student could actually integrate with the class through a robot. And I know there's a lot of other companies doing that same sort of idea, but these robots are astronomically expensive. I mean, you're talking £2,000-3,000 for a small robot that rolls around on a desk that actually, in terms of hardware, isn't very expensive to build. Something like virtual reality is more inclusive and easier to actually run with than buying specialist equipment than anything else, which is why virtual reality, I think, works better than having robots. But as long as the people who are in that space, i.e. the people in the classroom, can still interact with that student and not isolate them as well.
Exactly. And I think your point you made about augmented reality being the next leader, if you like, I think you're absolutely right. And I think where we are with virtual reality now, I think another 18 months, that's where we're going to be with augmented reality. And it's going to be very interesting how those, it's very interesting how those technologies are going to mix and how that's going to have an impact on not just inclusion, but diversity and inclusion as well, and what the potential issues could be in relation to that. So fantastic, thank you so much. That was a great presentation.
Oh,
More clapping emojis, please, for Chris. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Right, okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to turn on the ability for you to ask questions. Now, the way to do that is you should have now had pop up on your screen a raise hand emoji, well, not emoji, a raise hand option, actually. And all you need to do is, if you want to ask a question, just press that raise hand option, and a little hand will come above your head, and then I can come and unmute you, because you're all still muted at the moment. And that way you can then ask your question. So if you want to ask Chris a question, please put your hand in the air, and then we can ask you, and then you can be unmuted so that you can ask your question. So would anyone like to ask a question to Chris, please? No questions at all? Okay, while people are thinking of a question, I was going to say, Chris, this is a fascinating subject. I think it's something that needs a lot more research. I think trying to define what we mean by inclusion and diversity, whether that be based on a physical issue or a mental issue or sexuality or gender, which is basically what the diversity and access track is all about. It's a very difficult thing to do. And I think it's very easy to be able to exclude people by accident and not necessarily think of every possibility. And that's incredibly difficult for hardware and software developers and for members of the public as well. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, take, for example, we're in alt space at the moment, and we've all got an avatar that we've made ourselves, and we've decided to style either on ourselves or on somebody else. It doesn't matter. We can style it however we like. However, as you may notice, all of the avatars still have all four limbs. All the avatars are able-bodied. There's no avatar that's in a wheelchair. There's no avatar where I could say, well, actually, I haven't got a left arm, so could I remove my left arm, please? Certainly, some of those sorts of items would actually make things more inclusive, I think, for a lot of people that want to be able to express themselves exactly how they are. I've got a limited range of options for clothing, etc., but that could be actually a useful thing, because it means that you can end up with more of a uniform for a virtual reality and therefore not exclude people that there shouldn't be. Language, I still think, is a big issue. Having an equality in diverse languages that people in this room probably are saying and speaking, having the ability maybe to translate automatically or have people translate would be useful. Similarly, as I said before, it'd be really useful to have some sort of speech bubble above my head as I'm speaking that would let people see what there is, or even sign language. Something like British Sign Language is very different to American Sign Language, but it could be that you could have a virtual avatar that is able to actually show what I'm saying in sign language without there having to be an actual physical person doing those sign language translations. So there's a lot of things with equality and diversity that we can standardise an experience such as this, but we need to make it in such a way that it's flexible for every person to be able to use and change how they perceive it, but without
that's the
affecting
key, isn't
people.
it? Yeah, that's the key, that they can then change it to suit them. Yeah. It was
Exactly.
interesting, in a talk the other day, somebody was talking about the use of haptic technology to be able to allow for braille to be used in virtual reality. Because with the haptic
Yes, yeah,
feedback,
very
you
much
can
so.
then feel the bumps. And I thought, actually, I hadn't thought about that, and I thought that was a very interesting,
One,
concept. Yeah,
yeah, one
sorry.
of the places no, no worries. When I was doing virtual reality back in 2001, the most up-to-date virtual reality system was called Cave Environment. And it was very different to what we use now. It was basically 4 projectors that projected into a room, and you had a pair of 3D glasses that tracked where you were, so that you could actually wander around this room and see things in 3D. While that was all really good, you obviously couldn't feel anything. So what they actually came up with was little air balloons that you could put in your hands on series of gloves. It was very, very cumbersome. It didn't work very well. But as you came and approached an object, such as a wall or something like that, they would inflate so you could actually feel the physical object in 3D space. Now, if you are blind and you use, say, a white stick that you're sweeping across the floor to actually work out where you are, you could have actually used something like that in virtual reality and still experience the 3D virtual space without having to be able to see, with some sort of haptic technology in that way. So again, having that sort of inclusion, we focus very much on how things look in computing generally. That does exclude quite a large proportion of people, especially, I mean, even virtual reality glasses with glasses wearers are very difficult. But as we're becoming an ageing society, the focus should actually be more on how we can include people in ways that doesn't necessarily affect their vision.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I think part of the thing that I would also think about, sorry, I keep teleporting everywhere, part
No.
of the issue that I can see is we have limitations of bandwidth at the moment. So we all know that in the UK, for example, there are many areas that are still having problems accessing the internet at a half decent speed. So if we're now talking about using virtual reality on a larger scale with this level of diversity and integration, that's going to take more bandwidth. If we're already struggling trying to download a web page, how much more difficult is it going to be able to build these systems into a virtual reality environment?
Actually, it's going to be simpler than the video issues that we have at the moment. That's one of the big benefits of virtual reality. In 2003, I looked to create a new games console that I called the Revolution. It never went anywhere, and Sony stole the idea as PlayStation Portable, so it gives you an idea of what it looked like. But one of the ideas of that I had was for things like football matches. Now, back then, we didn't have 3G, it was all 2G mobile. And the idea was that if you had all the characters from a football game, as in all the, like a 3D game, downloaded to the device that you've got, all you actually need to track is the location of all the people in the ball, and you could actually watch the game in 3D and move around that 3D environment as you wish, for very, very low bandwidth. And it would be the same for something like this. At this very moment in time, the entire scene that we're sat in, this entire auditorium, has been downloaded to each of our computers. It isn't being streamed across the internet to each of us separately. All you're being given is a small amount of information about where each person stood, where their homes are, and unfortunately a large amount of information with the voice. But it's still much, I mean, this would actually work on a 3G environment rather than even 4G as a connection platform.
Right.
Whereas you certainly couldn't do that on, say, an iPlayer style video stream, which would require much higher bandwidth. So with a lot of careful thinking and careful preparation, you would actually be able to create a virtual environment which works for very low bandwidths.
That's interesting. All right, thank you very much. We do have a question from Holorus, so just unmute you there, Holorus. Just 1 second. Have you got yourself muted, Holorus? Because it's not allowing me to unmute you. Let me try. Right, if I do that, Holorus, are you able to hear me? No, okay, he's disappeared, so he won't be asking you a question then. I mean, as it happens, we're almost out of time anyway, but that was a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much, Chris. Can we give Chris clapping emojis, please? Thank you so much. That was great, and it actually highlights some really important issues that I don't think have been given enough consideration yet, so that was fantastic. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.